Thank you for tuning in to Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Sharon Pitluk Silver, and I am a Holocaust survivor, although I never really considered myself to be a survivor because I was a hidden child. I was born in November of 1941. So that was right in the middle of what was already going on. I was born in a small town in Poland called Knishin. And before the war started, Knishin was a community of 3,800 to 4,000 people, pretty much divided equally between Jewish people and Catholic people. There were approximately 1,800 of each. At the end of the war, there were 15 Jews who had survived. And when I heard that, I asked the man who had been keeping all the records, I said, am I one of the 15? And he said to me, no, no, you were Catholic. So now I know I'm number 16 who survived. And I'm going to tell you my story. But before I start, what I'd like to share with you is in our family, we have a book. I don't know if you can see or read this, but this says Nine Dorot. Dorot means generations. And in this book, we have a listing of the people who were murdered during the Holocaust. And as much as people were able to know, their names, if they had their date, if they had the relationships, and this was the closest they came. Now, in some cases, they knew the exact day. That's what happened in Knishin because the Nazis invaded. It actually was on my birthday in 1942, and they took the first 70 Jewish people they could find and they shot them. And then they had other Jews take them on carts. They said they were bloody, blood was running in the street. There's about 25 names for each page. Remember, this is just one family, just one family. So when you look at the impact on one family, can you imagine not only their lives that were lost, but the generations that were never to be because they never were allowed or able to have children or grandchildren, and their own lives were shot dead. When you think of someone like Dr. Salk, um, and I can't remember, Salk did the polio vaccine, the oral one, and I think it was Sabin who did the first shots for polio. Those of you who remember that, it was a horrible disease. And the two of them really knocked it out. We don't hear about polio at all anymore. The two of them were Jewish. Had they been, or their parents, been murdered, we would not have that. Well, I would hope we'd have it by now. But, there's a lot, a single person sometimes can make a dramatic, drastic change in the way the world goes. So I'm going to tell you my story now, and you'll see why I said I really am more comfortable with the title Child Survivor of the Holocaust. I was 10 months old, and a lot of what I'm going to tell you now is because my husband and my daughter and my sister and I visited Poland in 2006. It's amazing to me that it's that long ago. And we got a lot more information than we thought we were going to be able to get. And it really answered a lot of questions I had. So, this was the story that the woman who actually was my Polish godmother told me. She was looking out the window of her house one day and she thought she saw something a little strange. She saw a woman who was walking down the path carrying a baby, but she wasn't cradling her or carrying the baby over her shoulders. She was carrying her down near her hip, the way you would carry a sack of groceries. So being curious, she walked outside to see. And she said, as soon as she walked out, she understood exactly what was happening because down near the corner, there were a couple of um, um, Nazi so, soldiers. So she immediately knew that this woman was Jewish and she was trying to hide her Jewish baby. As the lady watched, she saw the woman stoop down and put the baby, that would be me, down on the ground behind a bush, which would shield me from view. And she immediately turned and walked in a different direction, very obviously hoping that if the soldiers saw anything, they would follow her and I would be safe. I'm not sure exactly what order things happened then. There are a couple of different stories, but I know ultimately I was taken to the village priest's home, and he said, "Oh, leave the child with me. I'll keep her." And the townspeople who were using their heads rather than their hearts, as he was, said, "No, Father, you can't do that because when the Nazis come in, they know priests don't have children. So when they see you have this baby, they're going to kill her and then they're going to kill you." Well, realizing the truth of that, he tried to find a good solution. And one of the stories that I love, because being a mom myself, I could understand. There was a woman in the village, a Catholic woman, who had, I think she had 10 children. And he went to see her and he said to her, "Look, we have this baby here. Can you take her in? Because they'll never be able to figure out whether you have 10 or 12 or 8 kids." And she looked at him and said, "Father, I'd like to be able to help, but there's no way I could take care of even one more child." you know, I could understand that. So there's where one of the little holes comes in, because I'm not sure what the next exact thing was. However, I wound up being taken to the local police station. This was not a modern city. It still is not modern or a city. It's still a little village, but it only has 2,000 people now rather than almost 4,000. Um, so the local police station was on the second floor of a home. The the whole town was like a crossroads. There, one main street going this way, one going the other way. There's nothing there. Um, so I was taken to the this police station, and in the police station there was a man standing off in the corner, and uh, you know nobody knows why, but when I saw him, nonverbal communication, I raised my arm and he walked over, he picked me up, he held me for a few minutes. And I will say, the fact that I had very fair skin, blue eyes, and my hair was a very light shade of brown helped a lot. Um, he held me for a few minutes and then he walked over. He was not a policeman himself, he was a friend who was hanging out with his friends at the police station. And he said, "My wife Regina and I have been trying to have a baby for a long time and we've been very unsuccessful. I'm going to take this baby home to my wife. Don't tell anyone. It'll be our secret." So I went into the police station being Shulami Pitluk, the first and only child of Shraga and Dvorah Pitluk. We went down the stairs, went across the street into a house, and there I became Anna Ostrowska, the only child of Chechika and Regina Ostrowska, and a nice little Catholic girl. So from the age of 10 months until the age of about 5.5, I lived with them as their child. Um, I have very few actual memories of that time. I'll tell you the ones that I could remember because to me they were like, "Oh wow." And that was actually one of the main things I was hoping to get out of our trip to Russia, to Poland, I'm sorry, was to find out if those memories that I actually had were real or if they were faulty. Um, and what I did find out was yes, they were absolutely real. So, one of the first memories, I always seemed to be playing with another little girl. I had no idea who she was, but every memory, pretty much every memory I had, I was outside with this other little girl who was probably about my age. Um, Another memory, again with the same little girl, we would run across the road. It wasn't even paved, so I don't really think of it as a street. We would run across the road to play in a house or in the basement of a house. It was rubble. Um, and we were constantly being told not to go there, that we were going to get hurt. And that's probably why I remember it because, you know, we were told don't go and we did go. Um, and that was one of the things I asked when I was there. Wasn't there a house right across the street of us? I think it might have been bombed out. And the little girl who grew up to be the woman that I was visiting and who was telling me so many of these things said no. And I thought, oh, okay, so that's a memory that doesn't seem to be real. And she said, no, it wasn't bombed, it was a fire. Uh-huh. My adult interpretation of a childhood experience. The other thing that stuck in my mind was going to church. We went to church a lot. You know, I pretty much was able to say, well, this is the way we went. Um, and I remembered it mostly because it was really uncomfortable. I was a skinny little kid, and the kneelers that they had in this church were wood and sort of sharp, and they really hurt my knees. So I probably remember either one day or a conglomerate of days with my Polish mother poking me on this side and saying, "Be still, stop wiggling." And my Polish father poking me on the other side 2 minutes later and saying, "Stop it, sit still." And I remember looking up at this huge statue, a crucifix, and thinking, I don't think God wants us to kneel when we pray. Because when we pray, we don't, when we're kneeling and we pray, all I can think about is my knees really hurt. And when I grow up, I'm not going to ever kneel when I pray. That was really I was probably 3.5 at the time. I thought that was a pretty adult kind of decision to come to. Um, but guess what? When I grew up, I was Jewish. We don't kneel when we pray. I had a hard time for the longest time. At the end of the service, usually the rabbi leading the service, says, bow your heads and gives a blessing to everybody. And I would bow my head a little tiny bit and hold my eyes up because I couldn't do it. So now getting back to the visit in 2006, my husband is somewhat of a scoffer. He's always teasing me, and he said, okay, let's see you get to church. You said you knew exactly, you could picture the route. So I said, okay, well, this is the way I remember going from the house that we lived in. You went to the road, turned right, and a few doors down, there was a big village square. Well, we walked a few doors, and I stood there and got very confused because it wasn't a square, it was a beautiful park with a lot of trees, pathways. There was a statue there. And I said, Alicia is the name of the woman who had been my little childhood friend. I said, I don't remember this. I remember a big square. I thought it was like a market square. And she said, oh, yes. After the war, my grandfather planted all these trees. So I took a diagonal through the square the way that I remembered that I would walk, and sure enough, at the other side there was the church. So that was another memory that I had. Life went on. Alicia and I were together a lot. And in that life, she was my first cousin. There were three sisters. Regina was one, and she had two sisters, and each of them had one girl. And after Chechik brought me home, Regina had a girl too. We were all within, um, Alicia and I were within 6 months of each other, and the third one, Batya, was a few years older than we were. Um, oh, I forgot to mention the fourth memory, which was a really big memory. I didn't know who he was, and it sounds sort of scary, but it every so often during the night, a man would crawl in my bedroom window. I had no idea who he was, but I did know he was a really good guy. Why? Because he brought me fruit. He would bring me an apple or an orange. And if he couldn't get any fresh fruit, because it was so hard to get during the war, he would bring me a small can of pineapples. Um, so he was a good guy as far as I was concerned. I didn't know who he was, and I was little, but what can I tell you? So life went on, and one night I woke up because there was a loud pounding on the door. There was a lot of yelling, a lot of crying, and all of a sudden, this tall man in a uniform burst into my room where I was sleeping and grabbed me, wrapped me in the blanket I had on my bed, and carried me outside. I always have to grin here because I was talking to a group of kids, and one of the kids raised his hand and said, "Were you afraid?" And I looked at him. I said, "Oh no, I wasn't afraid. I was terrified. Come on. I was 5 years old, and this strange man carries me out, and my mother, who all I knew, she was my mother. I had no memories of either of my biological parents. So there was a truck parked in front of the house. Now, trucks were very unusual at that time. This was in 1945. Mode of transportation mostly was horses, wagons, and if you were really rich, you could have a motorbike. Yeah, bicycles also. Um, as he lifted me to put me in the back of the truck, I could see under the brim of his hat. And guess what? It was the same man who had been bringing me the fruit. So I wasn't quite as afraid as I had been. I do not remember when he told me that he was actually my uncle. Um, Later, I talked to, and I probably should interject here that he was biologically my uncle, and he became my father. He became my father in name and in deed. And after we got to the United States, I think I was 7 when he married. And I've always, I mean, they've been my parents, and I always, when I say mom and dad, that's who I'm talking about. Um, so many years later, I asked my mother, and I said, I don't have any memories of finding out Daddy was my uncle. Do you know anything about that? And she said, oh, yeah, you started screaming, you can't be my uncle because I'm not a dirty Jew. I'm a nice little Catholic girl. Um, I bet I know why I suppressed that memory so entirely. Well, we drove out into the countryside. Before we left the town or the village of Knishin, he stopped and he got another little girl who was also a little Jewish girl being hidden by a Catholic family. And then we drove out into the countryside where we were taken to a safe house with blackout curtains in the middle of nowhere. And they put the two of us into a bed and said, go to sleep now. and there was a bunch of men in the other room whispering pretty much all night. From there, I was taken to a farm which was being run like a kibbutz and was also a halfway house. I had no idea what happened to the little girl, the other little Jewish girl. Um, but now, again, when I say my dad now, biologically he was my uncle. But he stayed in Poland and Germany for about 6 months with me. He was looking for survivors. He looked everywhere. And this tells the story. There were no survivors. He and I were the only two survivors of a very large and a very nice family. The family history included a lot of rabbis, a lot of teachers. Um, we wound up being able to migrate to the United States. Now, at that time, it was a really hard thing to do. The you had to jump through so many hoops and you had to fill out so many papers. For example, nobody had a birth certificate. Nobody had proof of birth because all the village halls had been bombed. So we had to get, and it was a lot, a certificate of identity in lieu of a passport. So that would be me. Hopefully you can see it. And this was my dad's. In addition to that, to come into the United States, you had to have a sponsor. And it didn't occur to me until I'd been talking for a few years, the connection between the word sponsor and responsible. But that's what being a sponsor meant. You were totally responsible for all the needs of anyone you sponsored. We didn't have the kind of programs that we have now where people are given help and people are given housing and stipends. You had to do it on your own. And if you couldn't do it on your own, your sponsor was responsible for housing you, feeding you, clothing you, making sure the kids got an education. And my dad had two first cousins who had come over before the war. One came to the United States, the other one went to Israel and served in the Haganah there, and then wended his way to the United States and lived in the same city as his brother. And Uncle Milt was our sponsor. Now, I said he was my dad's cousin, which meant he was my second cousin. But when you've lost your whole family, cousins become elevated to aunts and uncles. You know, um, one of the things that I always felt the lack of was I never knew a grandparent. I never had a real aunt or uncle. And life goes on. You do what you have to do. Um, so we get to the United States, we get to Cleveland. First, I lived with my Aunt Rose, again a cousin, for about 6 months. During that time, my dad had an accident in work. I don't know what it would be called today, but at that time, they called it water on the knee. He had to keep his leg elevated. He barely could walk. We lived on the second floor of a two-story house, and he couldn't do the stairs at all. So two things happened. He found a room, probably in some kind of a boarding house or living with another family that was on the first floor. And the cousins in Cleveland decided that I would do better and I would assimilate more quickly if I lived in a home with other kids. Aunt Rose was single. When we first got there, she was living with her very, very elderly mother who had passed away shortly after we got there. Her sister, Aunt Eva, was married and had two children, and I was moved to Aunt Eva's house where I grew up. I lived there from the time I was 6 until I was just over 7. Um, And Rose was as sweet as sugar. Oh, you could not find a bigger hearted, warmer, nicer, kinder person. And her sister had a little extra dose of vinegar. She was a good person, but she was pretty sharp and pretty strict. So then I remember my dad, who would come to visit me every weekend and as many times during the week as he could, saying to me that, can you close that, please? Excuse me, but I'm getting too much glare. Can you close that? Um, he said to me, I'm not going to be able to see you this coming weekend. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, I'm going to be going away, but when I come back, I'm going to bring you your very own mom. Well, that was really pretty cool because here I was 7 years old and I never had a mother of my own. And that's good. Um, so I remember meeting my mother for the first time. My impression of her was that's fine. She was a very, very pretty woman. She was a Holocaust survivor. She survived Auschwitz. She had numbers 27307 tattooed on her arm. And my dad was never taken to a concentration camp. What happened to him, going back to the day that the Nazis invaded Poland, they killed the first 60 Jews, and then they rounded up the rest of them and put them on um, in a train car. They had built tracks specifically to go to Treblinka. Thanks. To Treblinka. Well, he and his two brothers were on the train, and he watched for the opportunity and he jumped off the train. He rolled into a ditch and they were shooting at him and he played dead. And his two brothers, when they saw that, they did the same thing, but they were shot. They were shot and killed immediately. And the rest of his life, he had this survivor guilt. Had he known that they would do that, he would never have jumped first. And toward the end of his life, we were talking about it. We never talked about anything having to do with the Holocaust the whole time I was growing up. And he was well into his final illness, and he was talking about what a beautiful family. And he had these nephews. They were so strong and so smart. And if he had known his brothers would jump off the train, he wouldn't have. And I said, but Daddy, you saved them an awful lot of suffering. They were shot. They were killed instantly. They didn't have to go to Treblinka. They weren't gassed. I mean, there weren't a lot of options open to anyone. So now my dad brings home his new wife, and a short time later, we move into our own home, the three of us. And then we had this conversation. You know, as a kid, you even know that when you have a conversation with one parent and then you have pretty much the identical conversation with the other one, they got together and they figured this all out. So here's basically the way it went. Sharon, mom or dad loves you a lot. We love you as if you are our own child. And we don't want people saying that we're not your real parents. So we don't want you to tell people that we're your aunt and uncle. And I said, and I was 7.5. Well, what am I supposed to say? So we created this whole story like, oh, we were so lucky because mom survived Auschwitz, and daddy was a resistance fighter. He was one of the forced people. I could never understand how that happened. But you know what? At the end of the block that the house was on, Knishin is all surrounded with forests. So it was right attached to each village there. So, and Daddy found Mom after the war, and we were all reunited. He got me out, and he found Mom. And, what a really nice story. And that's probably one of the reasons that I speak to so many children's groups, because my story is not a frightening story. I survived. I, didn't suffer the way other people did. So, okay, I'm 7. They tell me to do something, I do it. And suddenly that became a very well kept secret. Became such a really good secret that as a young adult, the only person who knew was the guy who was going to become my husband. We got married and we had 3 kids. I should go back a little bit because my parents had 3 children. I was obviously the eldest because I was 7 when they got married. And then I have twin brothers who were born 8 years later because it took that amount of time with everything that went on in between. And then our sister was born 5 years after the twins, so I'm 13 years older than she is. They never knew. I married. My husband and I had 3 children. They never knew. This was a secret. My parents hadn't released me from it, and I take promises very seriously. And if I give someone my word, I like to think it's my bond. Um, I started to get concerned. My dad died, I guess you'd have to say, of natural causes. He was the first person in my family who wasn't murdered. Um, my mother, he died in 1981. My mother, over a few years later, maybe several years later, developed a really awful movement disorder. It's called progressive supranuclear palsy. It's the inside out of ALS. You start losing control of your extremities. It keeps progressing toward the center of you. She lost the ability to speak. She lost the ability to do any voluntary motions. Um, Before she lost the ability to speak, it was Passover time. And she was still living in Cleveland, which had me very concerned. And we brought her in to Chicago for the Seder. And my brothers were there, and my sister was there with various members of their family. Now, I'm just going to go diverge a little bit. When my daughter got married, she married a young man who has a very curious mind, which is really excellent because he's a doctor, and that makes him a very, very fine doctor. He listens to people, he absorbs, he asks questions, he's not superficial at all. And when they got married, after they'd been married a short time, my husband said to me, um, if anybody ever figures out that what your backstory is, it's going to be Mark. And I thought, So by this time, I was getting really concerned because I approached my mom. This is while she was still living in Cleveland, but it was shortly after my dad died. My timing couldn't have been worse. And I said, Mom, I'm really concerned that if the kids find out our story, they're going to be really upset. They're going to feel as if we lied to them. And it may change our relationship. We're a very close family. Um, as I said, it was just within a month or so after my dad had died. And she said, no, don't tell them. And I could understand, but it always bothered me because our rabbi used to say, truth has a way of bubbling up to the surface. So now we fast forward to um, the the late 90s, when um, she was visiting us for Passover, and most of the family was out because we had a lot of kids, and they took them to a park and whatever. And I was in the living room. My son-in-law was in the kitchen. My mother was in a wheelchair, and she was still able to speak, but short phrases, single words. And he was trying to get her engaged. And he said to her, "Grandma, isn't it amazing how much Kenny looks like his dad? Kenny's my nephew. His father's married to my sister, and they're cookie cutters." Um, and she nodded her head and said yes. Well, that doesn't seem like a lot, but that was a Friday morning, and um, it was a Friday morning, and she had not said one word from the night before. So we already had sat down at breakfast, and she couldn't talk, and everybody was feeling very glum because now, a progressive disorder goes sort of like this, but the ups are lower, the downs are lower. This was the lowest she'd ever been, and he got a response. So he said, "And Danny looks a lot like Debbie." Yes, he does. So Mark's figuring, oh, the better he can draw her out. So he went pretty much through the whole family, and he was really pleased because she went from a single word to phrases, and they were all appropriate. And finally, there were like 18 of us there. Finally, he said, "And what about Sharon? Who does she look like?" And she said, "She's different. She didn't come from my body." And he was shocked and stunned, um, having thought all this time that we were a very open family, which were and are, except for my parents' secret. So he looked at her and he said, "You mean she's adopted? Does she know?" And what my mom did then was, "Shh, it's a secret." Well, poor Mark went nuts. I didn't know any of this was going on. He he didn't know what to do. His next comment to my mother was, "But she knows, doesn't she?" And again, "Shh, it's a secret." So, what every good husband would do, he couldn't wait for his wife to come home with the children. They were supposed to meet, and he was going to take the boys for a haircut, and she was going to take um, the little girl for whatever. And he said, "No, Deanna, I want you to go with me." And she said, "But Mark." "No, Deanna, I want you to go with me." And they went back and forth for a minute. And I said finally to them, "Dee, if Mark wants you to go with him, what's the big deal? Go with him." Well, he needed to tell her what was going on. And the two of them discussed it. And, now their assumption was I was adopted, but I did not know because she said, "Shh, it's a secret." The truth was, of course I knew. I was 7 years old when they got married. Um, I didn't really remember anything about my life in Poland except the four things that I mentioned earlier. And now the secret was out. Well, I always laugh because Friday night's dinner, we had a Sabbath meal. All of us were around this large table. My mother was there in a wheelchair with her caregiver. My mother in law was there in a wheelchair also. And I got really choked up. I looked around the table and it was set beautifully, and my whole family was there. And I looked at my mom and I said, "Mother, look around the table. Can you believe not one person would be here if it weren't for you?" And she looked around the table with a beautiful smile and nodded her head. And now here's my thinking. Oh my God, life doesn't get better than this. How wonderful this is. Look at this family. Did I know that under the surface there were all these things going on. And, Deanna was, oh my God, how are we going to tell her? And Mark was, holy cow, what's going on? So the next morning, we all went to this little park where they had a great infants park for um, the little ones, and a walking path, and a basketball court for the guys. And, we were just hanging out together and enjoying being there. And I happened to notice at one point my sister and my daughter were sitting next to each other with their heads together. And my thought was, God bless them. They always find time to get together. A few minutes later, I noticed my sister with my husband. Didn't think anything of it. And then my sister came over to me and said, Cher, we have to have a sister talk. Now, my sister is taller than I am and much slimmer. We make a very funny looking couple. She's also quite dark complected. She walks across the street in the sun and she has a gorgeous tan. I'm fair skinned. I still, if I get in the sun, I burn. Um, we start to walk and she says to me, Cher, I know. And you know what? That's all she had to say. Those three words, Sharon, I know. And I knew what was coming, but the habit of so many years, I said, well, what do you know, Deb? I know everything. So what did I do? I burst out crying. I was crying from relief. And what does she do? What any loving sister would do. She burst out crying too. So the two of us are walking around this walking path, bawling our hearts out. And she's going, Cher, I don't want you to be unhappy. And I'm going, Debbie, but I'm not unhappy. You don't understand. This is wonderful. It's like a load has been lifted off me. So we walked probably a mile. I think that's how long the path was. And we came back to find that my son's family with their baby had gone back to their house so she could nap, and my husband had gone with them. Um, and I needed to tell my kids. I needed to tell my kids as fast as I could because this was a secret that I'd been carrying too long. Um, so we went over to my son's house. My daughter came with us. My son-in-law took their children to home for their naps. And when I got to my son Stephen's house, I called my third child, Alex, on the phone. And the two of them were sitting in the room, and Alex was on the phone. He went into his office and closed the door. He had no idea what was going to come. And I said to them, I don't want any of this nonsense about you told him or her first, so I'm telling you all at the same time. And then I told them the whole story. And their reactions were very typical of them. One of them jumped up, he's the historian in the family, and he needed to go and adjust his family tree, get it up to date. One of them said, I think I knew. I think Grandma told me. Obviously, patently not true. And the third one said, but why would they want to keep it a secret? They did such a wonderful thing, Mom. Why wouldn't they tell everyone? I thought it was a good question. And the answer that I had was my own supposition. First of all, when the refugees came over after the Holocaust, the fear was so great. It was much more than fear. And they didn't know what to expect. This paper that I showed you before uh, says who was accompanied, did anyone accompany you? And here it says, Kiva, there was his Hebrew name, father, with his child, Shulamit. So to him, it was not an untruth because from day one, he I became his daughter. what I didn't know and didn't learn till we were in Poland was he had had a daughter born just about the time of my first birthday. And while they were still in the hospital, the Nazis came and they murdered the child. That's a tough thing. I couldn't believe that he survived something like that. But obviously, I became the child to him that he had lost. Well, my concerns were poorly founded because that evening we sat around my family room, my brothers and sister, some of the cousins, my kids, and there was no difference. It was okay, so you weren't born to them, but you're still our sister, and I still feel like their sister. And as I say, life just went on. Um, I'm just trying to think. The the way we got to visit Poland was sort of interesting because uh, a year before we went, so it had to be in 2005, I got a phone call from my cousin, my first cousin, from my biological mother, who had been born in Israel but was living in New Mexico. And she had just come back from a 3-month visit to Israel. And she said, Sharon, her name is Shlomit. My Hebrew name is Shulamit. We were both named after the same grandfather, Shlomo. They're the similarity. She said, when I went to Israel, I met this woman who had spent her whole life looking for family or anyone who knew anything about her. She was also a hidden child and in the town of Knishin. And the hair on my arms stood up because what's the likelihood of two little girls in the same town? So she wanted to know would I be willing to talk to her. And I said, well, does she speak English or my Hebrew isn't good enough for a real conversation, and I can have somebody come over. She said, no, she speaks English. So I said, fine, absolutely. Um, and I spoke to her. Her name was Alicia. No, her name was Panina. Okay. Alicia was the little girl I played with. Panina was the little girl that Daddy picked up and put into the truck after he got me from the Ostrowski family. And she was telling me she was the only survivor of her whole family. She didn't know anything about them. She knew that she had not lived in Knishin before the war. So I told her what I knew, the little I knew. And when I got to the part about, then they put us in the back of the truck, she got all excited and said, a truck. I remember being in a truck. And I said, I have a picture of me with another little girl. I wonder if that could be you. She had very dark hair. And in the picture, she was about 5 and she had bangs. And Panina said to me, no, I never had bangs. So I had the picture enhanced and I sent her a copy and it was her. So although she had never found any trace of her family now, she had a picture of what she looked like as a little girl. That's one of the things we don't even think about. It's one of the little things. It's not that important, but I've got thousands of pictures of my children. I had 3 pictures of myself before the age of 7. Um, so it happened, she couldn't come to the United States. And my husband was ill at the time, and I couldn't leave him and go to Israel. But she told me that her son and daughter in law were on a 3-year work contract in California. So I called him, and he was very personable. We had a very pleasant conversation, and I ended it with the comment, well, if you want to do any traveling, we would love to have you stay with us. We live outside of Chicago. We have plenty of room. And, we'd make sure that you had the ability to get into the city. And he said, oh, that would be wonderful. And nice talking to you. And we both hung up. And I looked at my husband and I said, I just gave the kind of invitation I hate. Oh, if you're in the neighborhood, come by. I said, Passover is coming. Everything in our family seemed to revolve around Passover. Passover is coming up in, it was a month or 6 weeks. Why don't I call and see if they want to come for Passover? So I called him back and I said, so there would be good news and bad news. If you came for Passover, you would get to meet my whole family all at the same time. That's the good news. The bad news is, if you come for Passover, you're going to get to meet my whole family at the same time. We're a very loud bunch. We talk a lot, talk all over each other, but we'd love to have you. So he and his wife came, lovely young couple, no children. We talked a lot. There was one night he asked that we allow him to tape us, and he talked to me and got my whole story. Um, what he commented on was the difference between his mom and me. I had been married, had 3 children, had a very stable life, and really a very happy life. Penina had been sent to Israel at the same time that I came to the United States, where she was adopted by an Israeli couple who had a son 5 or 6 years older than she, and um, she was about 12 when the father developed, I think it was cancer, a dread disease, and he was in the hospital. So her mother would get her ready for school, send her off to school, and then get on a bus and go visit him in the hospital and come home just in time to get Penina off the bus. 3 months into this, her mother had a fatal heart attack on the bus. And shortly after that, her father died. So here was a child who survived the Holocaust and, by the way, lived with a family in Knishin who she said they were just awful people. She just hated it there. She was afraid she was going to die at any minute, and terrible thoughts for a little girl. Her brother, who was now 18 and she was 12, did his best to take care of her. He sent her to a boarding school, which was Monday through Thursday, and then she would be home Friday through Sunday and then go back to the school. Um, she eventually got a nursing degree, became a nurse, met and married a patient of hers, had 2 children, and ultimately was divorced. She spent the bulk of her adult life trying to find her roots. She went all over Israel. There are a whole bunch of places where people can hunt down any records, and never found anything. Everyone that she met, she would ask, do you know anything about this? Do you have any idea about this? And finally, there was someone who said to her, you know, um, you should talk to the Weinstein family, because there was a Weinstein who married a Pitluk from Knishin. So my dad was Akiva Pitluk. No, I'm sorry. My biological dad was Shraga Pitluk, his brother. My mother was Devorah Weinstein Pitluk. And Penina looked in the phone book. The whole country of Israel phone book was this big. And she arbitrarily called someone named Michal Weinstein, tells her story, and Michal says to her, you know, that really sounds like it could be my cousin. Her name is Sharon, and she lives somewhere in Chicago. But my sister Nahama would know more. So her sister Nahama, who lived on Kibbutz Shfayim, was called, and she said, "Oh, that really does sound like our cousin. She married somebody named Silver, and they live in Chicago. But my sister Shlomit would know because they were in touch." And there it was, 6 degrees of separation. She called Shlomit, Shlomit called me, and then Panina and I um, met. So we spoke several times. As I say, my husband was ill, and for whatever reason, she couldn't come to the United States. And one day she called me and said, Ohad, that's her son's name, insists that he's taking me to Poland so that I can find out once and for all whatever there is to find out. Would you go with me? And I thought, whoa, Poland is not a place I ever had any interest in going to, but I could see a good reason for us to go together. So I said to her, I think I would. When do you want to go? And she said, well, he already booked our everything, and we're going on May 6th. Yeah, well, my one of my twin brothers was getting married in Arizona on May 7th, and there was no way I could not go to his wedding. So I wished her well and went to the wedding. We got back from the wedding on a Monday, and on Tuesday, I got a message on my answering machine from Ohad. He said, we didn't expect to find very much, and we didn't find very much, but we met these people, and they they took us to their house after the guide showed us all through Knishin, and the woman said, my aunt also hid a Jewish child. Her Jewish name was Shulamit, and she was stolen during the night one night, and we never ever knew what happened to her. Well, that was patently untrue because they knew that it was my uncle who had come. He had come to the house to say, um, I want to take her back. The parts there are a lot of big holes. One of the big holes is they were living in his house. The Chechik was working in his cheese factory. So filling in blanks, I sort of felt as if since Chechik was his employee, he had struck some kind of a bargain. Take this child and take care of her. If I survive the war, I'm going to come back. Well, he survived the war, but he came back 4.5 years later, and they had raised me from the time I was 10 months old, and they didn't have any other children. And Regina, especially, just, she didn't want to get me back. That's who was crying. So, Ohad and um, Panino were at the home of Alicia. Alicia was the little girl that I had played with all the time. She was my first cousin in Poland. And while I was listening to his voicemail, the phone rang and it was him. So there was nothing to it. I had to go visit Poland. It was, I don't know what your religious beliefs are, but I felt as if it was the finger of God poking me and saying, okay, you've got to do this. It's time. And that's how we wound up going to Poland. Um, and I think probably that's really, I love to end with a story. It's an old tale that's told in Judaism and probably in pretty much every other religion too. Um, there had been a terrible storm, and at the seashore, there were a lot of starfish that had been washed ashore onto the sand. And starfish can't survive out of the water, nor can they maneuver out of the water to get back to it. So there was an old man who was walking early morning, And as he would walk, he would bend down and just pick up as many starfish as he could and walk them and put them back in the water. And he kept doing this. In the distance, there was a young runner, and what he said was, um, as he approached, he said, "Oh man, what are you doing? There are thousands and thousands of starfish. If you throw some back in the water, do you think it makes any difference at all? You must be nuts." The old man patiently looked at him and said, "You know, it might not make a difference, but it definitely helps the ones that I managed to get back to the water." And in some ways, I see myself as the starfish because along the way, there were so many times when somebody was there to help me into the next phase. And one person can have a huge impact on the world. You never know. You know, I love the idea of paying kindness forward, and you don't know the effect of your actions, negative or positive. And now, if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much for sharing. Um, Remarkable story, and your family sounds lovely.
They really
Um,
are, I must admit. And it's gone down to the next generation now.
Brilliant. We do have a couple quick questions. When did you start sharing your story, and how did you get involved with the museum?
Okay, so for a long time, I couldn't even talk. I had a rough time with the Holocaust. I still, how could this be? How could somebody, a human being created in the image of God, come up with such diabolical, horrendous things? My mom had started talking, and when she was no longer able to talk, I realized I have to speak for her. And that's really how I got involved with the museum. You know, I resisted the label of Holocaust survivor because I felt it was disrespectful to people who had gone through concentration camps, who had suffered. I lost my whole family. That was bad enough, but I was taken care of. And I think I was probably um, loved pretty much in every phase of my life. Um, so I actually, after she stopped, I contacted the Illinois Holocaust Museum and went through a process and got vetted and became part of the Speakers Bureau. And primarily, I've been sharing my story through the museum. When I go there, it's mostly high school and sometimes junior high and college kids. But I've spoken in the community as well.
Brilliant. What, and I think you might have touched a bit on it, but what's your earliest memory of coming to the US?
Oh my gosh, the ship was so scary. Okay, I didn't even know what the name of the ship was. My husband did some research, and it was the SS Ernie Pyle. Um, we came, I think it was like steerage. First of all, it was not a cruise ship, it was not a luxury ship. I can remember.
Hospital ship.
Hmm?
Hospital ship.
I don't even know if it was he said it was a hospital ship. But they had men's quarters and they had women's quarters. So every evening, my dad would take me to a spot on the deck, and this woman would meet us there. And she would take me downstairs to get me ready for bed and sleep. And every morning, she would take me back up and return me to him. The thing that I remember most was this fear, that there was waves of fear, waves of terror going through. The people were so scared, so frightened. They're not going to let you in. They check between your fingers. They check behind your ears. You know, if you have any kind of a cut, you're not going to be allowed to go in the United States. It was so scary. It was so scary because the people were so fearful. And I do remember landing. I thought when we went to visit Staten Island, no, where the Statue of Liberty is, Liberty Island. There was a gate there, and I looked at it. I was with a very close friend of mine, and I said, "Oh my God, that's exactly the way I remember it. It was a chain link fence. You got off the ship, and you were in this big square area, and then they opened it up, and you passed through. I guess it was immigration." But then when I did a little bit of research, they weren't using Liberty Island at that time, but they must have had very similar ports, wherever people were coming in. And then Aunt Rose and Milt, the he was the cousin who sponsored us, and she was where we were going to live, came and met us at the dock, and we took a train with them over to Cleveland, Ohio.
Right. Courtney has asked, how should people approach a survivor to learn more about their experience?
So at this point, now, like if someone had approached my parents uh, in earlier days, they probably would have been very resistant. A lot of the survivors just didn't want to talk about it, and especially the ones who went on to create lives. I think what people have to understand and learn is the survivors had an incredible amount of strength. This was the first time anything like that, the unimaginable became manageable. The unimaginable happened. These were people who lost everyone in their family. They lost the family pets. They watched younger brothers and sisters and babies being murdered and tortured in front of their eyes. And yet they had the strength to start a new family, knowing that anyone that they loved became a hostage to fortune. I mean, I can't imagine. I said when I found out that my dad had a baby who was murdered, I couldn't imagine how he survived that. Can you imagine what any one of these people could do or would deal with the loss of a second family or a member of a second family? So, you know, we're all getting older. I'm one of the very youngest people who survived because I was born right in 1941 and I was taken care of. Most of my generation was totally annihilated. Um, I think all you have to do is tell them this is something that you've really been interested in and would they be willing to share some information with you. Be respectful. The worst that can happen is they'll say, no, I don't really like to talk about it.
Thank
But
you
I
so much.
think we're all very aware of the fact our days are numbered and our numbers are numbered.
Um, uh, Another question we've gotten is, are you close with any other survivors, maybe in the area? Do you connect with them often?
It's interesting because in Cleveland, when we lived in Cleveland, every one of my parents' friends were survivors. And when we lived in Chicago, we lived in the suburbs, and no. Um, there was a Sunday morning we were reading the Sunday paper, and my husband read to me, "Hey, look, here's an article. There's a group being formed, Children of the Holocaust." And I was like, "Whoa!" This big light bulb. I said, "That's who I am." I was never comfortable being called a survivor, but I was a child, a hidden child of the Holocaust. So I did go to a couple of the organizational meetings. Now, this is a very personal um, story, and it only applies to me. I found it too painful. Somehow, instinctively, to me, I knew that I couldn't live in both places. I couldn't have one foot in Poland and keep thinking about what happened to me, to my family, and one foot in the United States and having a new life and a new family. And I opted to put rooms. I have rooms, and the war was a room that I really did not want to visit very often or at all. Um, and now, yeah, I do have some friends who are survivors. Primarily, our contact came about because of the museum.
Another question we've just gotten is in your opinion, how is anti-Semitism the same or different from other forms of racism and discrimination?
Is it different? I don't think so. I think anti anything is anti. And it upsets me because anti Semitism is so much on the rise. My granddaughter is at the University of Pittsburgh. She was at the Tree of Life Synagogue 2 weeks after the congregation was shot up and so many were killed. Um, I my two youngest grandkids, they're both girls and they're both sophomores in college, and they both have a lot of anti-Semitism on their campuses. It's very overt. And there's a lot of pro-Palestinian, which I think is a function of the education that these kids have gotten. And I remember as a kid, my Sunday school teacher said when he set up the Palestinian camps, there was space available and homes available, but instead he moved all the Palestinians who were living in Jerusalem into tent cities and taught them, indoctrinated them to know everything that was wrong that was happening was the fault of the Israelis. It was patently untrue, but they were brainwashed, really. So, did I answer that?
I think so.
I do let my personal opinions come through.
It's okay. Is there any one question you get asked often about your experience, or one that someone asked you that you remember the most?
It's the really odd ones. That question when that little boy said, "Were you afraid?" I mean, that's right up there at the top because who expects a kid listening to what happened to another kid ask a question like that? Um, no, there's a very broad range of questions, and a lot of them depend on the people's backgrounds.
Right. One more question before we
Okay.
end it. What message or takeaway do you want people to have from hearing your story and your family's story?
Okay. So love conquers. One person can make a difference. Think about that pebble that goes into a lake and has increasingly larger waves coming out. Um, you know, I don't have any particular skill set and I'm not brilliant and you know, the Holocaust is something that's beyond my perception. I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out how could this have happened? How could it have happened? I understand what happened, but how could a human being come up with such horrendous plans? The thing that sort of breaks my heart is it happened, so now we know it can happen. And that's not the end. There have been additional things that, where someone is trying to wipe out a whole population. The children of Darfur, oh my now we're supposedly more civilized and more we've got more of a background, we know what can happen, and yet they keep on happening. So I wish I had some really wonderful wise words, but I just don't.
Understandable. We did get one more question real quick. What should people read or watch to learn more about the Holocaust?
Well, that's an interesting question. There is so much literature out there now, and if you're in Illinois or in any other city, well, in Chicago, or any other city that has a Holocaust museum, if you go into their gift shops, there are so many first person memoirs. Um, there are children's books now available where there didn't used to be. You know, I raised my kids knowing they had enough education on the Holocaust. They were born with it. My little girl was maybe 2 years old. When I was at home, she would sit on the counter and help me cook. When we went to Cleveland, she would sit on my mom's counter. And one day she said to my mom, she called her Mom, what are those numbers on your arms? What's that on your arm? I don't think she even recognized them as numbers. Just and my mother said to her, "Oh, that was something a very, very bad man did." "Oh, can I kiss your owie?" So she kissed her owie. The next time we were in Cleveland, my mother had a band-aid that exactly covered her tattoo. And I said, "Mom, you always said when we had enough money, you were going to get the tattoo erased. And yet you didn't. How come?" And she said, "Because there are always going to be people who deny the Holocaust. And this is the way I have of showing them this happened. People tattooed other people."
Thank you so much for sharing your story. That is all the questions that came in, so I will let you sign off and say goodbye to everybody.
Okay, well, then I want to thank everybody for tuning in and joining us. Next Wednesday at 10 o'clock Central Time, you can hear Holocaust survivor Ernest Freihoff. He'll be sharing his story. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts where we're going to be posting streams of contents through the weeks ahead. All of these are being recorded and they're going to be available in an archive so that you can get on Facebook and listen to as many as you want. And that would also be the answer to the question, how do I find out? And here's another thing. At the Illinois Holocaust Museum, I think we were the first in the world where they have these holograms of various Holocaust survivors. These are fantastic. These people went to California and I think they had a dozen cameras around them from all angles. It's in a separate theater. It looks like they're real, you know. I remember the first time I saw one of the presentations, I was afraid he was going to step off the stage, and I had my hand like that. But they're programmed, the film is programmed so that you can ask questions and the survivor will answer those questions for you. And if you're hesitant about going face to face with someone, you can do that. And I think there are other places now that do have the holograms. I think we're up to 10 or 12 of them in Skokie. So that's another really good way to do it. And I just want to thank you all for your support. These are very extraordinary times this week, even more than usually extraordinary. So let's stay together. And love is better than hate. And thanks for listening.